At the previous level, we saw how the mind can side with control simply in order to survive. Not because it loves power, but because it fears chaos. Tonight, we go deeper still, because when that consensus stabilizes, the past itself begins to shift. Not loudly, not violently, but quietly, gently, almost kindly. Carl Gustav Jung understood that memory is not a fixed archive. Memory is a living process, revised each time it is touched. He wrote, "Memory is not a storehouse of facts, but a living process. When the present requires safety, the past is rearranged to support that safety, not by erasing pain, but by changing its weight. Gentle moments become clearer. Harmful moments grow dimmer, more distant, as if they no longer matter. This shift does not feel like deception. On the contrary, it feels reasonable. When the mind has chosen consensus to survive, it needs a coherent story in order not to tear itself apart. Jung called this the psyche's need for coherence. He wrote, "The psyche seeks equilibrium. When the present requires you to stay, the past will be retold, so that staying feels justified. And in this new story, what caused pain is softened, not to deny it, but to reduce inner friction." What is subtle is this: the revision is very kind. It does not accuse painful memories. It wraps them in context. They were struggling too. I didn't fully understand back then. Every story has two sides. These statements are not false, but when repeated often enough, they replace experience with interpretation. Jung warned, people do not have ideas. Ideas have people. When the idea everything has a reason takes control, it restructures memory in order to protect itself. In this process, the past ceases to be a place of learning and becomes a sedative for the present. Uncomfortable memories are placed farther away, like old furniture in a rarely used room. You know they exist, but you no longer touch them. Jung described this as the withdrawal of consciousness from tension-producing contents. He wrote, "What you resist persists. But sometimes, what you rationalize does not persist. It dissolves. Not by disappearing, but by losing its capacity to warn." The Stoics understood this phenomenon differently. They emphasized the distinction between events and judgments. Epictetus said, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." When survival is threatened, the mind adjusts its judgments to reduce disturbance. The past, when retold in gentler judgments, no longer triggers the nervous system, and that calm is mistaken for healing. Jung did not deny the need for this. He knew the nervous system requires calm to avoid collapse, but he warned of the cost. Historical intuition becomes blurred. When the past is retold solely to serve a safe present, it loses its orienting function. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When memory is revised unconsciously, you do not call it a choice. You call it what's already over. The kind shift of the past has another feature. It reverses the roles of victim and circumstance. Not to accuse, but to dull sharp edges. You begin to remember more vividly the moments when you endured well, showed understanding, grew mature. Less vividly, the moments when you were hurt, confused, afraid. Jung called this identification with the survival role, when the identity of the one who endures gradually replaces the identity of the one who feels. And when identity changes, memory follows. Jung wrote, "The shoe that fits one person pinches another. There is no recipe for living that suits all cases. But when the mind needs a recipe to continue, it simplifies the past into neat lessons. Suffering becomes experience, Loss becomes growth. Anything that does not fit that formula is reduced in size. The Stoics would remind us that clarity requires comparison. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If it is not right, do not do it. If it is not true, do not say it." But when the past has been softened to serve the present, comparison disappears. There is no longer a reference point to ask, how much did this actually hurt me? Not because you forgot, but because the memory is now told in a different voice. Jung saw the danger here. When the past becomes too kind, it stops warning. There is no inner bell, no red signal. And when the signal goes silent, the present continues without knowing what it is repeating. He wrote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it," a line often attributed to Santayana, but one whose spirit Jung echoed throughout his work. To remember here is not merely to recall events, but to remember the feeling that once said no. Still, Jung did not call for tearing memory open in the night. He understood that the kindness of memory is also a form of protection. What he invited was recognition of the process, recognizing that the past is being retold so that you can remain safe. That recognition does not demand immediate action. It simply keeps truth from being sealed shut. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The darkness here is not painful memory itself, but the way memory is softened to serve consensus. When you see this, the past does not need to become cruel to be useful. It only needs to retain its shape without being wrapped too thickly. And then, very slowly, a healthy distance appears between compassion and denial, between lesson and warning. You may still tell the gentle story, but without trading away the original feeling. Jung believed that as long as this distance exists, the process of individuation has not been interrupted. Because in the end, the past does not need to be fair. It needs to be truthful. Truthful not in the sense of accusation, but in the sense of not being distorted for survival. When the present becomes safer, memory can speak more honestly without causing collapse. But to reach that day, the most important thing tonight is simply to notice. If the past is becoming unusually gentle, it may be because the present needs it to be so. And that noticing, very quiet, is already a step. Not to break safety, but to keep a small lamp lit. A lamp that reminds you that memory may change its voice, but the original experience is still there, waiting to be fully heard. And it is precisely in the moment when the past begins to be retold in a gentler voice to serve the safety of the present that we touch a deeper truth about memory, that it was never something fixed. We often think of memory as a record, something stored, something retrieved, as if the past lies somewhere in a sealed drawer, waiting to be opened when we need it. But Carl Gustav Jung understood that memory does not operate like an archive. It is a living process. Each time you remember something, you do not reopen the past, you recreate it. And that recreation always carries the imprint of the present. Jung did not view memory as a fixed image, but as a living symbol. He wrote, "Psychic contents are not things, they are processes. Psychological contents are not immutable objects, they are processes. This means that memory changes according to the psychological context of the one who remembers. When you are safe, memory can soften. When you are threatened, memory can be adjusted to reduce conflict. Not because you wish to distort the truth, but because the psyche is always seeking self-regulation. Each time you recall, memory is rewritten in the ink of the present. Details that fit the story you need now are brought into focus. Details that create tension fade. Jung described this as the dynamism of the unconscious, where the past continually interacts with present needs. He wrote, "The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good." The unconscious does not only contain shadow, it also contains subtle protective mechanisms. Among them, the adjustment of memory so that you can continue to live. This explains why, when consensus with control has stabilized, the past begins to shift in a gentle way. Not through blatant denial, but through soft retelling. You remember a painful event, but the feeling is different. You remember that you were hurt, but the pain seems farther away. Jung would say that memory at this point no longer serves historical truth, but psychological equilibrium. And in a context of survival, equilibrium is prioritized. The Stoics, in their own way, also touched this truth. Epictetus said, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." When memory is recreated, what changes is not only the image, but the judgment that accompanies it. The past is no longer remembered as what happened, but as what I understand now. And because present judgment requires calm, memory is shaped in the direction of least disturbance. Jung warned that this is not lying, but symbolic adaptation. He wrote, "Symbols are the living forms of the psyche. Memory, while alive, is always symbolic. It represents what the psyche needs to understand, to hold, to forget at this moment. Therefore, memory does not merely recount the past. It expresses your current relationship with the past. And that relationship can change as circumstances change. The danger does not lie in memory changing." Jung did not believe in a pure, immutable memory. The danger lies in forgetting that memory is changing. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When we believe our memory is an objective record, we grant it absolute authority. But when we understand memory as a living process, we retain distance, enough to listen without being blindly led by it. The truth is this: memory is shaped not only by what happened, but by what we need to believe in order to continue. When the present does not allow leaving, memory is recreated to make staying feel reasonable. Jung called this the synchronization between the past and the current identity. If your identity is the one who endures, memory will tell a story of endurance. If your identity is the one who understands, memory will emphasize moments of compassion. The Stoics would remind us that clarity requires re-examining judgment. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it." When memory is recreated, the estimate, the appraisal, the judgment is what changes. And when judgment changes, emotion changes. The past does not need to disappear. It only needs to be re-evaluated so the nervous system can relax. Jung saw both sides of this process. On one hand, it keeps you safe. On the other, it can blur signals. When painful memory is softened too much, it stops warning. You no longer clearly sense what once crossed a boundary. Jung did not call for clinging to suffering. He called for keeping memory alive without distorting it. He wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The darkness here is not painful memory itself, but the unconscious way we edit it in order to survive. The most important thing is to recognize the living nature of memory. When you understand that each act of remembering is an act of recreation, you stop asking, "Is this memory absolutely true?" You begin asking, "What is this memory serving in the present?" That question does not accuse memory. It frees you from identifying with it. Jung believed that individuation does not require us to fix memory, but to enter into dialogue with it. When memory is seen as a living symbol, you can listen to its message without letting it define your entire being. Memory then ceases to be a prison and ceases to be a sedative. It becomes a messenger, sometimes telling the truth, sometimes speaking in a way you can bear. And this understanding creates a precious stillness, a stillness in which you can say, "My past is being told this way because my present needs it so." That recognition does not make the past harsher. It simply returns to you a choice. When you need the kindness of memory, and when you need the raw honesty of the feeling that once existed. Because in the end, memory is not what happened. It is the ongoing relationship between you and what happened. And when you understand that, the past no longer quietly steers you. It remains alive, but no longer at the wheel. And once we understand that memory is not a fixed record, but a living process, recreated each time it is touched, the next step becomes clear. What is repeated most often shapes the strongest memory. The mind believes in repetition. When a story is told once, it feels like an opinion. When it is told many times, it begins to feel familiar. And that familiarity, very slowly, turns into certainty. This is not gullibility. It is a survival mechanism. The human brain is designed to reduce tension. It favors what is predictable because what can be predicted feels safer. And so, when a story is repeated long enough, the mind stops asking whether it is right or wrong and begins to ask a different question. Is this familiar? When the answer is yes, the nervous system settles. And that settling is mistaken for truth. Carl Gustav Jung recognized this mechanism at the deepest level of the unconscious. He warned that repeated contents do not need to persuade through logic. They seep in. Jung wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When a story is repeated without being brought into reflective awareness, it sinks into the unconscious. There, it no longer feels like a suggestion. It feels like memory. This is why phrases such as, "You always feel this way," "That's what really happened," "You're remembering it wrong," do not require force. They do not need threats. They only need to be repeated in a context where tension needs to be lowered. With each repetition, the mind updates itself to reduce contradiction, not to betray truth, but to preserve stability. Jung did not see this as weakness. He saw it as the psyche's balancing drive. He wrote, "The psyche seeks equilibrium. When there are two versions of the past, one that creates tension and one that soothes, the mind will lean toward the version that is repeated more often because it brings familiarity. And familiarity, in the language of the nervous system, is safety." The subtlety is this: repetition does not erase the old memory immediately. It lightens the weight of the old memory while adding weight to the new one. A detail that is repeated becomes brighter. A detail that is not mentioned recedes into shadow. Gradually, the picture changes tone. Jung called this symbolic restructuring. Memory does not disappear. It changes roles within the inner narrative. The Stoics approached this truth through the language of judgment. Epictetus said, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." When a story is repeated, the accompanying judgment is repeated as well. And when a judgment is repeated long enough, it is no longer experienced as a judgment. It becomes self-evident reality, not because it is absolutely true, but because it is the least disturbing version. Jung went further. When repetition occurs within a power relationship, even one that is subtle and internalized, memory begins to serve consensus. He wrote, "People do not have ideas. Ideas have people." An idea repeated long enough begins to have a person. It organizes how we remember, how we feel, how we explain. And because it reduces tension, it is rewarded by the nervous system. No coercion is required. No argument is necessary. The mind updates itself, like a software system that prioritizes patches which make it run more smoothly, even if those patches alter how old data is displayed. Jung did not call this deception. He called it unconscious adaptation. Danger arises only when we forget that an update has taken place. Repetition has another effect. It weakens sensory memory. You may remember the event, but no longer remember the feeling that once accompanied it. And for Jung, feeling is the key. He believed memory is not merely imagery, but emotional energy. When that energy is drained by the repetition of a soothing narrative, memory stops warning. It becomes fine, even if it once was not. Marcus Aurelius warned of this habit when he wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts. Repetition dyes the soul." When the familiar color washes over every recollection, distinctions blur. And when distinctions blur, discernment fades as well. Jung called this the sleep of consciousness, not because of lack of intelligence, but because of an overwhelming need for calm. The crucial point is this: repetition does not need to be true in order to become memory. It only needs to be familiar, and familiarity hurts less. Jung warned that if this process is not brought into awareness, we will call its outcome destiny. He wrote, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When memory is rewritten through repetition, you do not say, "I chose this version." You say, "That's just how it was." Jung did not suggest breaking repetition through confrontation. Confrontation only heightens the nervous system's defenses. He suggested recognition. Recognizing that a story is being repeated to reduce tension, not necessarily to tell the whole truth. That recognition does not erase the new memory, it restores distance. Distance enough to ask, is this story keeping me safe, or is it covering something over? The Stoics would call this clarity. Epictetus said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." Clarity can increase friction, but Jung would add, clarity does not have to be loud. It can be a quiet note in the mind. This is repeated often, therefore it is familiar, not necessarily because it is complete. When you hold that note, repetition loses its absolute power. Memory is no longer a command. It returns to being a living version, something that can be listened to, compared, placed beside the original feeling. Jung believed individuation begins precisely here, when we stop confusing familiarity with certainty. Because in the end, the most comfortable certainty is not always the deepest truth. The deepest truth often carries a little friction, but it also carries direction. When you recognize the power of repetition, you do not need to destroy the familiar story. You only need to stop letting it ride alone. And in that quiet space, where familiarity no longer equals certainty, memory begins to breathe again. Not to accuse the past, not to deny the present, but to give truth a place to stand, even when it speaks very softly. And when a story has been repeated long enough to become familiar, the mind no longer needs to erase the old memory. It only needs to remove its weight. At first, the changes are extremely subtle. There is no shock, no rupture, only softened edges. Details that were once sharp now blur. Emotion shifts almost imperceptibly, like the light changing color at the end of the day. What once felt painful is retold in a lower register. It wasn't that bad. What once felt clear suddenly becomes uncertain. Maybe I wasn't remembering it objectively enough. You do not lose the memory. You lose confidence in it. And it is confidence, not recall, that gives memory its weight. Carl Gustav Jung understood that memory is not merely imagery, it is psychological energy. When that energy is reduced, the memory still exists, but it no longer carries orienting force. Jung wrote, "Psychic contents are not things, they are processes. Psychological contents are processes, and because they are processes, their intensity can shift without their form changing. A memory can remain intact, yet if the emotion attached to it is muted, the memory stops warning. This fading is not denial, it is adaptation. The psyche seeks to reduce tension by softening what causes pain." Jung said, "The psyche seeks equilibrium. When truth creates disturbance, the mind prioritizes balance, and balance is achieved not by erasing truth, but by dulling its sharpness. The cutting edge of memory is wrapped in context, explanation, comparison, all of which soothe. The most subtle change happens at the level of confidence. You still remember the event, but you no longer fully trust your perception of it. You begin to question your own memory. Was I exaggerating? Maybe my emotions distorted it. These questions sound reasonable, but when repeated, they erode the foundation. Jung warned, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When doubt toward your own memory operates unconsciously, you do not call it a survival strategy. You call it objectivity. The Stoics approached this through the language of judgment. Epictetus wrote, "It is not things themselves that disturb us, but our judgments about them." When memory is softened, the accompanying judgment softens as well. And when judgment softens, boundaries blur. What was once unacceptable becomes understandable. Not because the event changed, but because trust in the original feeling weakened. Jung called this the decompression of the symbol. Memory, as a living symbol, gradually loses pressure. You can recount the story without feeling much of anything. This brings calm, and because it brings calm, the nervous system rewards it. Jung wrote, "People do not have ideas. Ideas have people." The idea, "it wasn't that bad," slowly acquires a person. It organizes how you remember, how you narrate, how you evaluate. This shift also reverses the center of gravity, from experience to interpretation. Instead of asking, "How did I feel?" you ask, "What is the reasonable story?" Jung was clear. Understanding does not require the loss of feeling. When understanding is used to replace feeling, intuition starves. He warned, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." The darkness here is the fear of friction, the fear that if you trust your memory, you will have to face something uncomfortable. Marcus Aurelius reminded us, "If it is not right, don't do it. If it is not true, don't say it." But when confidence in memory erodes, the standards of right and true lose their anchor. Not because morality disappears, but because morality requires memories with weight in order to stand. When weight diminishes, judgment loosens. Jung did not urge us to be harsh with memory. He urged honesty with the process. Honesty that memory is being softened so you can survive. Honesty that this softness has a cost. Direction becomes blurred. He wrote, "The greatest danger to the psyche is the lack of consciousness." The danger is not that memory becomes gentler, but that we do not know it is becoming gentler. The key issue is confidence. Memory cannot guide if you do not trust the original feeling. When confidence is lost, memory becomes decoration in the present story, not a signal. Jung believed individuation requires restoring just enough confidence, not to accuse the past, but to maintain boundaries. How is confidence restored? Not through argument, but through listening to bodily response when memory is touched. Not asking true or false, but asking, how does my body react? Jung trusted the intelligence of the body. He wrote, "The body is the unconscious made visible." When a soothing story goes too far, the body often does not agree. A tightening, a hesitation, a fatigue. These are the remaining weights. The Stoics called this clarity, distinguishing what belongs to you, judgment, sensation, from what does not, another's interpretation. Epictetus said, "If you want to improve, be content to be thought foolish and stupid." Holding confidence in original feeling can increase friction, but that friction signals the return of orientation. In the end, Jung reminds us, memory does not need to hurt to be useful. It needs to be honest. Honest that it once carried weight. Honest that it is growing lighter. And honest that this lightening serves a present need. When you can hold these three truths at once, memory no longer has to be exploited, nor does it need to scream. Because you have not lost the memory, you have lost confidence in it. And when confidence is restored, very slowly, very quietly, memory regains just enough weight to do the only thing it needs to do, to guide, not to punish. And when memory has lost the weight of certainty, the next shift no longer occurs in emotion. It occurs in the very sense of who I am. The Stoics believed that character is formed through repeated impressions. Marcus Aurelius wrote that the mind becomes dyed with the color of the thoughts it habitually entertains. Epictetus warned that every impression that enters unexamined quietly becomes a habitual reaction. But Carl Gustav Jung went one layer deeper. He did not speak merely of character, he spoke of identity. For Jung, the question was not only, how do I react, but who do I believe myself to be? Jung believed that identity is woven from memory, not memory as an exact record, but memory as a living story we believe belongs to us. He wrote, "The ego is not the whole personality, but only its center. The ego is only the center. The whole personality is upheld by layers of memory, symbols, and interpretations that have settled over time. Who you think you are depends directly on what you believe you have lived through, what you believe you have endured, how you believe you survived, and what lessons you believe you learned from it all. So when memory changes, not erased, but shifted in meaning, identity adjusts quietly. There is no inner debate, no moment of, I've been convinced, only a very subtle feeling. Perhaps I've always been this kind of person." Jung called this the restructuring of the personal narrative, and he warned, people do not have ideas, ideas have people. When memory changes meaning, the idea of me changes with it, and that idea begins to possess you. The Stoics understood this on a practical level. They believed that if you repeatedly receive certain impressions without reflection, you will become someone who reacts according to those impressions. Epictetus wrote, "Make it your study, then, to confront every harsh impression with the words, 'You are but an impression, and not at all the thing you appear to be.'" But Jung added a deeper warning. When impressions have crystallized into memory, and memory has been woven into identity, confronting impressions is no longer enough, because what is being challenged now is not a thought. It is a sense of existence. Observe how identity shifts when memory is retold repeatedly in a different tone. The person who once said, "I was hurt," begins to say, "Maybe I was too sensitive." The person who once believed, "That wasn't okay," begins to think, "Maybe that's just how things are." Not because they were persuaded by argument, but because the foundation has shifted. When the foundation changes, the house does not need to collapse. It simply rebalances itself. Jung wrote, "The unconscious is not just evil by nature, it is also the source of the highest good. The unconscious is not malicious, it adapts. When memory produces prolonged tension, the unconscious does what it does best. It reorganizes the story so that you can continue living. And in that process, identity is edited to fit the new story. The danger does not lie in adaptation itself. It lies in confusing adaptation with truth." The Stoics emphasized clarity, but clarity, as Seneca suggested, requires the capacity to stand apart from oneself. When memory has become identity, that distance disappears. You no longer have a story. You are the story. And then, anything that challenges the memory feels like it is challenging you. Jung described this as a dangerous form of identification, when the ego dissolves into the narrative and all difference is experienced as threat. Jung warned, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." When identity is built on shifted memory, your subsequent choices will be guided by a new self, and you will call the outcomes personality, destiny. This is just who I am. When in reality, they are the result of a quiet process in which memory changed meaning and identity followed. The Stoics would not ask you to destroy that identity through force. They would ask you to observe. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Look within. Within is the fountain of good, and it will ever bubble up if thou wilt ever dig." Jung agreed, but added that looking within is not about finding comforting answers. It is about recognizing the story that is operating, not to deny memory, but to loosen absolute identification with it. Because you are not everything you remember. You are the one who is remembering. And that difference, fragile yet decisive, is where freedom begins. When you recognize that your identity has been woven from memory, and that memory is a living process, you do not need to destroy the past. You only need to stop letting it quietly continue writing who you are without your awareness. Jung did not promise a correct identity. He promised a conscious one, a self that knows its foundation can shift, and therefore is no longer fully governed by that shift. As he wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." And truly, here, does not mean fixed. It means seen, lived in the light of awareness. When memory changes meaning, identity follows. Not loudly, not through argument, just a very slight movement of the foundation. And that is precisely why the essential question is not whether memory is right or wrong, but who is allowed to decide the meaning of that memory. And when identity has begun to adjust itself to memories whose meanings are shifting, that process does not stop at emotion or narrative. It continues, quietly, in the very shape of what we remember. Imagine footprints on a beach. At first they are clear. You can see the direction, the rhythm of the steps, even hesitation in the spacing. But then the tide comes in. Not violently, not sweeping everything away in a single moment. Just thin waves, again and again, long enough for the edges to soften. The shape is still there, but the sharpness is gone. And at some point, you are standing there, not because the footprints have vanished, but because you no longer know which direction you were walking. Carl Gustav Jung would say this is exactly how memory is reshaped, not through denial, but through the erosion of meaning. He did not see memory as a stored photograph, but as a living imprint in the psyche, shaped by time, emotion, and above all, by the need to survive. Jung wrote, "Memory is not a storehouse of images, but a dynamic process. Memory does not stand still, and whatever continues to move never retains a fixed form. At first, a memory carries weight. It has direction, it has a conclusion, it carries the feeling. This happened, and it meant this. But when the present becomes uncomfortable, when holding on to the old meaning creates inner conflict, the psyche does what it has always done best. It adjusts to restore balance. Jung called this the psyche's self-regulating tendency. The psyche seeks equilibrium. And to achieve that equilibrium, memory does not need to be erased. It only needs to lose sharpness. Like footprints in sand, a memory touched repeatedly by emotional tides becomes vague. You do not say, "That never happened." You say, "Maybe I'm not remembering it accurately." Not because you were convinced by an external argument, but because confidence in the memory has dissolved. Jung understood this clearly. He wrote, "Doubt is not the opposite of certainty, it is its shadow." When doubt is planted long enough, memory does not disappear. It loses its outline. The Stoics taught that the mind is shaped by repeated impressions, but Jung revealed a deeper layer. Those impressions do not only shape reactions, they reshape the past. When a new interpretation is repeated often enough, the original memory is not denied, but overlaid. Like sand beneath water, it is still there, but the contours are no longer visible enough to orient yourself. What is striking is this. There is no moment when you notice the change, no inner alarm, no clear sense of loss. Jung wrote, "The unconscious works invisibly. The unconscious does not argue, announce, or explain. It simply works. And its task here is to make memory less distressing. When memory becomes less sharp, emotion hurts less. When emotion hurts less, the present becomes more tolerable. And so the reshaping continues, not out of malice, but out of kindness toward the nervous system. But that kindness has a cost. When you can no longer see your own footprints clearly, you do not only lose orientation toward the past, you lose an anchor for the present." Jung emphasized that memory does not merely tell us what happened, it tells us who we were within that flow. When the contours of memory dissolve, identity loses subtle points of anchoring. You begin to feel as though you are drifting, not exactly lost, but no longer standing firmly on the old story. Jung warned, what we do not confront in ourselves, we will meet as fate. When this reshaping happens without awareness, it does not feel like a psychological process. It feels like this is just how things are. You no longer clearly remember what you once thought, felt, or believed. All that remains is a smooth present, where the past is no longer sharp enough to raise questions. And it is precisely in that smoothness that control becomes easier. The Stoics believed inner freedom comes from distinguishing what is within our control from what is not. But that distinction requires clear memory. When footprints fade, when direction disappears, the mind no longer has enough reference points to say, "This is my boundary." And so instead of freedom, it chooses safety. Safety in vagueness. Safety in not remembering too clearly. Jung did not say we must cling to memory at all costs. He did not advocate preserving every contour of the past. What he warned against was reshaping that happens in darkness. Because when you don't know that your memory has changed shape, you also don't know how your identity has shifted with it. And then you are not controlled by force. You are controlled by disorientation. Return to the image of the beach. The footprints do not disappear because someone wants you to lose your way. They fade because the sea does not stop moving. And the psyche is the same. It is always in motion. The question is not, how do I preserve the footprints? The question is, who is watching the tide? Jung believed that healing does not come from restoring every detail of memory, but from recognizing that memory has been reshaped. When you can see that, you do not need to fight the sea. You only need to stand a little higher than the waterline, high enough to see that the shape has changed, but the ground is still there. Nothing has been erased. It has simply been reshaped. And the very act of seeing that reshaping, without judgment, without urgency, is the first step toward finding orientation again, even when the old footprints are no longer as clear as they once were. And when the footprints of memory have softened under the tide of reshaping, the mind does not only lose orientation toward the past, it also loses its anchor for judging the present. The Stoics taught that a person is free when they examine impressions before accepting them. Epictetus emphasized, "Make it your study to confront every impression with the words, 'You are but an impression and not at all the thing you appear to be.' That is, do not immediately believe what appears in the mind. Pause, look closely, question it." But this teaching quietly assumes something crucial, that the ground for examination still exists. That memory remains clear enough for comparison, that the past is stable enough to serve as a measure. And it is precisely here, when memory becomes uncertain, that such examination begins to fail. Carl Gustav Jung saw this fragile moment with great clarity. When memory no longer carries the weight of certainty, the mind loses its capacity to compare. You are no longer confident enough to say, "Is this similar to, or different from, what happened before?" Not because you refuse to examine, but because there is no longer an anchor from which to examine. Jung wrote, "The loss of certainty is the loss of orientation. When certainty dissolves, direction dissolves with it. And in that void, the mind is compelled to grasp onto something else. That something else is often not truth, but consistency. Because consistency does not require verification. It only requires repetition. When everything inside becomes vague, whatever repeats steadily begins to feel safe." Jung warned, "The unconscious does not think in terms of truth or falsity, but in terms of familiarity. The unconscious does not ask, 'Is this true?' It asks, 'Is this familiar?' And familiarity to a mind exhausted by uncertainty is far more comforting than accuracy. You begin to rely on stories that do not contradict one another, rather than stories that fully reflect reality. What is smooth, coherent, and low friction is preferred. Details that cause discomfort, even if they may be true, are labeled complicated, unnecessary, or making things harder than they need to be." The Stoics called this a dangerous trade-off, exchanging clarity for temporary calm. Seneca wrote, "It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste much of it. We do not lack time to see clearly. We lack tolerance for inconsistency." Jung went deeper still. When memory becomes unstable, the mind builds artificial consistency to replace it. Not by inventing something entirely new, but by selecting fragments of memory that fit the story being maintained. He wrote, "The psyche creates reality every day. Psychological reality is not recorded, it is created. And when the goal is to reduce tension, the reality that gets created prioritizes livability over correctness. The danger here is not that you choose consistency. The danger is that you forget you chose it. Consistency gradually feels like self-evident truth. Anything that does not fit is dismissed as an exception, misunderstanding, or worse, overthinking." Jung warned, "People will do anything, no matter how absurd, in order to avoid facing their own soul." When examination requires confronting inner uncertainty, the mind is willing to sacrifice precision to avoid that encounter. The Stoics emphasized prohairesis, inner choice, but choice requires discrimination. When memory is no longer clear enough to serve as a foundation, discrimination weakens. You no longer ask, Is this true? You ask, does this fit with what I already believe? And that is a subtle but decisive reversal. Because from that moment on, belief no longer serves truth. Truth begins to serve belief. Jung called this state the closure of consciousness. When conflicting data is no longer allowed in, the mind becomes consistent, but impoverished. He wrote, "A person who has not passed through the inferno of his passions has never overcome them." If we cannot tolerate the temporary chaos of examination, we will choose the artificial order of consistency. And that order, however soothing, does not liberate. Consistency is easier to maintain than accuracy because it does not demand courage. Accuracy requires accepting that memory may hurt, that the past may be discontinuous, that identity may not be fully coherent. Jung believed psychological maturity lies not in having a smooth story, but in being able to endure fracture without immediately repairing it with illusion. And so, when memory is uncertain, when examination becomes difficult, the mind chooses the path of least resistance, keeping everything consistent. Not because it is true, but because it prevents the nervous system from collapsing. This is not something to condemn. It is something to see, because only when you see that you are relying on consistency rather than truth can you, when safety allows, reopen the capacity to examine. Jung did not ask you to shatter that consistency immediately. He understood that doing so could cause harm. He only invited a very quiet awareness that consistency is not the same as correctness, and that there are moments in life when accuracy must wait, not because it is unimportant, but because the mind is not yet strong enough to bear it. The Stoics would call this wise postponement, not betrayal of virtue. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "If it is not right, don't do it. If it is not true, don't say it." But he also knew that to recognize what is right, the mind must be clear. And clarity cannot be forced in the darkness of uncertain memory. So if tonight you realize that you are leaning on what is consistent rather than what is accurate, see that not as failure, but as a sign of a mind trying to stay upright. When the tide recedes, when the footprints begin to reappear, even if they are not exactly as before, the capacity to examine will return, quietly, without drama, just as a very gentle question returning to the mind. Is this truly true? Or is it simply what I have grown used to believing? And it is precisely that moment, the moment when a question can be asked without causing collapse, that inner freedom begins to be reborn. And when the mind has grown accustomed to relying on consistency rather than accuracy, when the question, "Is this true?" is replaced by, "Is this contradictory?" then an even deeper door quietly opens, the door that leads straight into identity. And here is the quiet truth. Whoever controls memory controls the person you believe yourself to be. Not by changing the present, but by rewriting the past. Carl Gustav Jung saw this as one of the most subtle forms of psychological power. A power that doesn't need to command, doesn't need to coerce, doesn't need to prove. It only needs to shift the foundational story on which the ego is standing. Jung did not see memory as a neutral sequence of facts. He saw it as the living material of identity. He wrote, "The ego is the subject of all personal acts of consciousness, but that ego does not exist in a vacuum. It is nourished, reinforced, and shaped by what it believes has already happened. When the meaning of the past changes, the ego does not need to be persuaded. It adjusts itself to fit the new story. And that adjustment feels natural, reasonable, even mature. This is why controlling memory does not need to be brutal. No one has to say, 'That never happened.' It is enough to say, 'Maybe you misunderstood.' No need to deny emotion, just blur the context. No need to invent a new past, only change the tone in which the old past is told. Jung called this the operation of the collective and personal unconscious, where interpretations repeated long enough sink beneath awareness, no longer experienced as opinions, but as self-evident memory. Jung warned, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. When memory is rewritten unconsciously, your present choices no longer feel influenced. You do not say, "I act this way because I was shaped." You say, "I act this way because this is who I am." And here, power reaches its most perfect form. Power internalized as identity. The Stoics understood this differently, but no less deeply. They emphasized that we are not harmed by events, but by our interpretations of events. Epictetus wrote, "Men are disturbed not by things, but by the views which they take of them." But Jung added a deeper danger. What happens when the memory of the event itself is reinterpreted, repeated, and softened until it no longer feels like interpretation at all? At that point, the ego is not merely reacting to the present, it is living inside a revised past. And once the past has been revised, recovering it is no simple task. Jung did not encourage digging through memory to find a single, absolutely correct version. He knew memory is always symbolic. What he emphasized instead was awareness of the process, that memory is not static, that forces such as fear, the need to belong, and exhaustion have bent the story to protect the psyche. To recognize this is not to rebel, but to avoid being completely identified with the story being told. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. Acceptance here does not only mean accepting one's shadow, it also means accepting that one's identity has at times been shaped by memories that were not fully truthful. Not because we were weak, but because we needed to survive." The quiet truth is this: many people are not controlled by the present, but by a past that has been softened to make it bearable. The Stoics would not call this moral decay. They would call it a survival reflex of the mind. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "The soul becomes dyed with the color of its thoughts." Jung would add, "And those thoughts are dyed by the memories we believe are ours. When those colors are selected and repeated long enough, they become the fabric of the ego. You no longer see the color, you live inside it. So tonight, there is nothing that needs to be restored. No need to force memory back into its proper place. No need to drag the past out by violence." Jung did not believe in healing through coercion. He believed in gentle awareness. There is only one thing to recognize. Memory may have been rewritten, and recognizing that fact is already an act of freedom. Recognition does not mean rejecting everything you remember. It means loosening the absolute identification between memory and identity. You no longer say, "I am what happened to me." You begin to whisper, "I am the one who is remembering." And that memory has its own history. This very small distance, Jung believed, is where consciousness begins to return. And this is also where the next door opens. Because when the ego becomes fragile, when identity is no longer firmly anchored in certain memory, the mind begins to search for a new foundation. Often, it is not personal truth, but belonging. At the next level, we will explore what happens when the crowd replaces the self, when the need to belong, to dissolve into we, begins to override individual conscience, when the question is no longer, "Is this true for me?" but "What do others think?" But for now, rest. Jung understood sleep as the space where the mind temporarily stops narrating itself. In sleep, you do not need to remember who you are. You do not need to protect any memory. You do not need to keep the story consistent. Sleep does not require memory. Let the mind loosen its grip on certainty. Not to forget, but to stop controlling. Because sometimes, Healing does not come from remembering more, but from allowing yourself not to remember for a moment. Sleep now. The ego can rest without dissolving, and when you wake, the memories will still be there, but perhaps they will no longer hold you quite as tightly as before.